You are listening to Geopolitics and Empire Support the Renegade transmission. Some of the best ways you can do that is by subscribing to the Supercast or Apple subscriptions, where you can listen without the ads, and there's a monthly and annual option there. Substack as well. Unless you're from Airstrip One or Australia, there in those locations, they're asking for your biometrics. I'll be working on other options, but that's going to take quite a long while. You can always donate, purchase a console if you want to chat with me, and do check out all of my sponsors and affiliates. Joining us for the very first time is former U.S. Army officer Brad Miller. He writes and vlogs over at Substack, X, and YouTube. All of those links are in the description. Welcome, Brad.
Hey, thanks so much for having me on. I know it's the first time that we've done a chat like this, but I appreciate your work, appreciate the quality of guests that you have had on before. So really looking into digging into some important topics.
Yeah, and I've been I learned of your work recently. I've been enjoying your feeds, checking out your podcast appearances, your Substack, where you're talking about the deep state, coups, a lot of military stuff, because you are I don't know, a military man. And just real quick before getting into some of the big topics, whatever you want to tell us about your background and the work that you're doing now. From what I gather, you sort of transitioned from officer to dissident, and COVID 1984 or COVID 9/11 sort of helped that along. Yeah.
Yeah. So I grew up in North Carolina. I live now in Tennessee. And after high school, I went to the military academy at West Point, graduated, and in 2003, I went into the Army. So, if you think about the timeline as to where we were in 2003, I was I was very bought into the system. I grew up in a small town in central North Carolina, a little north of Charlotte, but a small town, a very conservative town. I would say most people in my town, went to church on Sundays, a patriotic area of the country. So that kind of describes this cultural environment that I grow up in, right? So then it's no surprise when I end up in the military a couple years later. So in high school, looking at options, decide to go to West Point. While I'm at West Point, 9/11 happens, and I am as hoodwinked as anybody else. And for me, I would say that it hit very close to home. One, just because I'm in the military, and I immediately know that this is about to determine the trajectory of my military career, which it did, because, I would graduate, I would spend 19 years in the military. And that was really kind of, under the years of the GWAT, the global war on terror. Right. But also it hit home in a geographical sense, because for those who may not know, West Point is in New York. It's about 50 miles north of New York City. So I mean, this 9/11 happened. Ground zero is effectively kind of in my backyard as to where I was at the time. So it was very impactful for me, and would impact not just my career trajectory, but even it would reinforce a lot of those ideas that I already had. I very much grew up thinking that, America was, the city on a hill, right? I mean, that's how I viewed America. And so for me, did I feel this patriotic duty to, as an able-bodied American, particularly as an able-bodied male, did I feel this pull to go into the military? Yes, I did. And I wanted to do that. I also thought that I'd be good at it. I thought it would be a challenge. I mean, there were plenty of things that set me in that direction, but when 9/11 happened, this kind of crystallized in my mind. I am where I need to be in order to perform the most good. And I would stick to that mindset for the next couple of years. And I did a deployment to Afghanistan from early 05 to early 06. And while I was in Afghanistan, I truly thought that I was there fighting terrorists for God and country. That's what I thought. I came home a year later still believing that. And then about 2007, I started to come across some information that would challenge that paradigm. And I'll tell you, one of the first pieces of information that I came across was actually the old documentary Loose Change. If you remember that.
That was my going down the rabbit hole. Yeah.
There you go. So for me, a lot of people like you, me, other people, right? There's kind of that event maybe that first challenged your worldview. For me, it was 9/11, but it wasn't immediately. It took me several years, and I kind of had to grapple with it. But then once I realized, hey, the world does not work the way that I have grown up thinking that it works, then, like you just said, I went down the rabbit hole. Well, what else is not the way that I have perceived it to be up to this point? And then you just kind of keep digging. And so that process of research and challenging assumptions and refining my worldview, it just never stopped. So then fast forward a decade plus. Now I will say this, and if people are familiar with me, they probably heard me tell this story before, but there may be people who have no idea of who I am, and that's cool. Why would you? But I, in the wake of learning about 9/11, which I started to kind of research into in 2007. So 2007, 2008, 2009, kind of in that time period, I considered getting out of the Army. And I had fulfilled my obligation to the Army that I incurred by graduating from West Point, so I could get out. And I strongly considered getting out about 2009-ish. And ultimately, I made the decision to stay in. And the defining principle for me there was, hey, things are bad, but we still need good people in positions of influence where they can do good things in the institutions that they would have. Now, that outlook would change kind of a decade plus with the whole COVID nonsense, right? So I was a captain at that time when I started looking into 9/11. Fast forward, though, and I'm a lieutenant colonel, and I was promoted to lieutenant colonel in early 2020. The whole COVID nonsense happens. I'm selected to be a battalion commander. So I served as a battalion commander within the 101st Airborne Division within the Army, for those who are familiar with that. A long storied legacy. And I would take command of this battalion in 2021 in the summer, just ahead of when the COVID shot mandate would be implemented across the military. I was never going to take a shot. I had questioned what we had been told about COVID all along, from day one, because if you take where I was in 2007, right? Well, by 2020, that's 13 more years of research. And even though I've been in the Army this whole time, and even though I'd, done another deployment to Afghanistan, I'd spent a year in Honduras, I'd spent 3 years in South Korea. I trying to do my best to try to grapple with these things personally, still believing that we needed good people in these positions to do the right thing, right? But when COVID comes along, I realize how big of a deal this is. And then when the mandate is implemented and I realize DOD is all in on this, which didn't surprise me, but it just drove home in my mind, this is so much bigger than 9/11, so much bigger. And the situation is so much worse than I maybe believed it was a decade earlier. So that's where I realized, hey, I'm not gonna go along with this. And if I lose my career, then I lose my career. It is what it is. Maybe I don't belong in this institution, because it's thinking that I can change the institution from within, or we need good people. I just realized that that's probably not enough. It's too bad, right? So I would be fired of command in late 2021. So I was only in command for about 4.5 months. I took command. I made it very clear that I was not going to take the shot. I was not going to order my troops to take the shot if they didn't want to. Many of them had already taken it before I took command, but the mandate did not go into effect until about 2 months after I took command. So anyway, I was fired in late October of 2021. And then a couple of months later, once I realized that the military was not going to walk this back, they were all in. They weren't going to realize what had happened and reinstate me into command. Like, that was not going to happen. So in early 2022, I submitted my resignation. I would finish out a couple of months later, kind of as the resignation process went through administratively, and exited the military in the fall of 2022. So I served a total of just over 19 years on active duty. And for those who know anything about the pension process for the military, you can qualify for your retirement pension at 20 years of active service. So I was about 8.5 months shy of that. But it is what it is. I don't regret it. And over the last 3 years or so, I have not even seriously considered even trying to go back in. There's this reinstatement process now that is more for show than any true substance. It's very clear that the Department of Defense, which now calls itself the Department of War, does not really want people of principle back in, people who actually take their oath to the Constitution seriously, people who are going to question the legality of orders. They don't actually want those people back. They are kind of making a little bit of a show to make it appear as if they do. But I'm not fooled by that, and I have not seriously considered going back in. So sorry to kind of ramble on a little bit about me, but that's kind of my story and how it is that I kind of feel about my own career, where we are now, and may help people understand where I'm coming from and why I hold some of the opinions that I do.
No, these stories are important, and I think we learn a lot from them, from listening to your story, your experience. That's what I've been doing my whole life. I've traveled and lived around the world, and just hanging out with people and just listening to these types of stories and incorporating the lessons into my own life. And if I end up at some crossroads, oh, well, I think about, that Brad, something like that happened to him. Am I going to make the right decision? And so maybe to ask you, maybe we can return to COVID in a bit. So now to ask you, I always like to start big picture. What in the heck is going on? And people talk about deep state. I've heard, there's globalist deep state. There's the acronym that matches geopolitics and empire, globalist American empire, and I like to play with that sometimes. But long ago, I saw you. I was listening to one of your lectures. You held up Peter Dale Scott's book. I interviewed him, I think, like 13 years ago on my previous channel. He's very old now. He's in his like mid 90s. But my view is that we are up. This deep state is global. So it's not like if you talk about deep state in the US, yes, there is one, but it's not centered in the US. I view it as this international deep state that has then it's plugged into the nations. So it's an international class, and it's plugged into Kremlin and CCP and EU and US. And so your thoughts are there. For me, that is like the engine that's driving everything. That's pushing all of the other events, as we mentioned, 9/11, COVID 9/11. I mean, I saw you talking about, we can get into these deep events, an ongoing coup. John Laughlin, I think he's a great guest of mine. I don't know if you know John Laughlin. His father worked for CIA. Actually, I think he said that when JFK said he wanted to split the CIA into 1,000 pieces, I think his father was one of the guys who was going to open the new office, and he thinks he was taken out. But just, I guess my question is then, there's been this ongoing coup, JFK, I think there were international actors involved there as well. So JFK, 9/11, COVID 9/11, how do you sort of view, who is this and what is this globalist deep state, and what do they want?
Yeah, so I see it very much the way that you just described. So I would say what we think of as the deep state, the American deep state, I would say is more accurately described as a colony of a deep empire. And that empire is worldwide, or at least virtually worldwide, because I do think that there is a power structure which is effectively controlling most of the assets of the world. And I think that when we see things happening, whether it's here domestically within the United States, or whether it is abroad in Russia, or even if it's Africa or Latin America or wherever else, right? What we're seeing is still the reaches of this worldwide deep empire, which does keep itself quite hidden. But I very much think that our deep state, if it is in fact just a colony of this vast worldwide deep empire, which I believe that it is, then this superstructure that we call the deep state, they're not the shot callers sometimes that people tend to think that they are. They take orders as much as they give orders, And so and I think this is where people maybe don't necessarily see that. So there may be some people who say, okay, I get that Trump is beholden to those who kind of helped him get into the Oval Office. But I think it goes much deeper than that. I think that there are powers that are not American, that this American deep state is very, very much beholden to. And these people that we may think within the context of the United States are powerful, they, to a large degree, are subordinate to other powers, some of whom are very hidden, and it's kind of hard to even know exactly who they are. But also, you almost have to realize, I think, that some of these people that sometimes we think are powerful, well, they're allowed to be powerful. They were made by these other people that are higher up on the totem pole, and they can probably very quickly be unmade if it came to it. So I think that very much describes Trump. Trump is not in any way an opponent of the deep state. That, of course, is the way that we have framed his presidency. But that's, well, first of all, it's totally inaccurate. And it's completely inaccurate. It's not just an unsophisticated way to look at it. It is like that idea is entirely inaccurate. But it is the framing that has been placed around his presidency, because there are a lot of people, particularly conservatives. And I say this as somebody who is I understand where conservatives come from. I consider myself a conservative. I don't consider myself a Republican and haven't in nearly 2 decades, but I am a conservative, right? So I understand where people are coming from, but Trump is not a champion of liberty that is standing up against the deep state. He is an asset of the deep state that has been framed as an opponent of the deep state. And again, just to kind of circle back where we started with the question, because it's a fantastic question. The American deep state, again, is just a vassal of the worldwide deep empire. But it's an important one because of the military and economic prowess that the United States has. But let's not think that the United States is the bully on the world block. It's a dog. It's a big dog, but it's a big dog that is on a leash.
I would totally agree with that. Trump is the deep state asset. And I guess my next question, for me, as I see it, the big end game is this world federation, this totalitarian, technocratic world government. They've talked about it for decades. And as we speak, they just announced the Board of Peace in Davos, which my first thing is like, that's a new world government institution. It's the biggest psyops that they're throwing at us. What do you think are some of their top end game goals here for the planet?
Yeah. So I think they want to control the assets and resources as much as they can around the world. And I think for them, they view human beings as just one type of resource, right? But I think there are other types of resources that we would also. So, for example, and we could talk more about Venezuela or Greenland more specifically here in a moment for sure, because this is where I think these things play in. So with Venezuela and oil, is that important? Well, I would say yes and no. Or Greenland with different types of resources that may exist in Greenland. Is it that we want access to those resources, or is it more just about being able to defend against Russia, et cetera? Well, I would say it is about resources, but it is more than that. It isn't for Venezuela. It isn't just about the oil, though I think that is a reason. But I do believe that it certainly looks like they are building out this idea of the technate. And a lot of people have seen this map that's been floating around. A lot of people have been calling attention to it recently. And it looks like both control of Venezuela and areas around that portion, kind of the northern portion of South America, and control of Greenland, both very much fit into kind of the northern and southern borders, respectively, of this kind of, technate. And you just mentioned technocracy, and I think that's very much what we're seeing. So when we talk about control of resources, a lot of what we have to kind of maybe take a an updated view of the war for resources is that a lot of resources now are going to be needed to fuel what's happening kind of in the digital world, so whether it's the resources that would be needed to kind of fuel AI, because I think that's going to be huge when we talk about technocracy. So I think that's kind of what's happening. And then the way in which it's framed to get people to go along with it. Here are a couple of thoughts that I would offer about that. So one, where possible, and I think that a lot of this power structure, these people of influence kind of at the top, whomever they might be, right? I do think that a lot of these individuals operate on occult principles. And I think that's quite apparent, right? Well, one of the occult principles that I think they operate on is this idea of consent engineering. And for them, our consent is important to them. One, not just so that we don't challenge what they're doing, but also I believe that they think that there's kind of almost a dark energy that is harvested as people consent to what's happening. So let me explain this a little bit more for people who maybe this might be a little bit new to them, though I'm sure you have a very informed audience. But I tend to speak a lot about what is happening in military language for two reasons. One, it's because I think it aptly describes what's happening, because I do believe that we are in a war. And if we define war so narrowly that we only think in terms of guns, tanks, bombs, explosions, then we're going to miss that, hey, there's more to war than that. We're very much in a war, but it's operated along other modalities that people don't necessarily associate with war. We could talk more about that in a moment. But the second reason that I talk about this is just because it's also just my background. There's some, there are experiences and a jargon that I think also describes what is happening that, I'm familiar with and can use to explain it in a way that I'm comfortable explaining it, because I do think it is in many ways the best description, right? So when we look at what I would call operations, like a military operation, you plan and you execute a complex operation. A lot of these occult engineers that are controlling things around the world, what I would call an operation in military terms, they might call a ritual. And I think they mean that quite literally. It almost becomes one and the same, So for them, when they're going to conduct some sort of dark ritual on populations wherever, right? And then they can get that target population, us, to consent to it, it makes the ritual more powerful. And I do believe that they operate on this principle. This is not just, me making up stuff here. I think that's a real thing. So one of the ways in which they get people to consent to this is by use of these, binary or dialectical constructs. And here's the way that I think they use this is they want to catch the segment of people that are, they offer you an either or choice, right? And of course, it's a false binary, but that's the way they offer it to you. And they want to catch the segment of people who are kind of smart enough to see through the one side, but not clever enough to see through the other side. So they don't recognize it as a false binary. And then they kind of catch the decoy. They're smart enough to catch the decoy, but then they kind of get caught up over here, And I'll give you some examples of that are probably no surprise to some of your audience, but I think it's important to understand this because it happens both domestically and internationally. So the whole left-right divide in the United States is those labels are largely meaningless because both sides are ultimately controlled, but they will use the left sometimes to put forth one component of the plan, and sometimes that is to generate some chaos. And then you'll get a segment of the population that will react to that chaos. And then as soon as a solution is offered, they'll immediately latch onto it. But that solution was always predetermined. And that path was always the path that was intended for the population to go. It's almost as if, these narrative engineers, they know the populations well enough that they know if I can introduce this stimulus into the system, the people, or at least a certain segment of the people, we know that it will elicit this response. So we can just, introduce the stimuli the way that we need to, and we know that a certain segment of the population will go this way, right?
Just to add real quick, the latest example from yesterday, ICE doing away with the Fourth Amendment, saying now they can enter your homes without a warrant because immigrants, right?
Because immigrants, right. So I think the way that we're supposed to look at that is this was never about illegal immigration. So even if so for the people out there who say, hey, illegal immigration, they broke the law, like we should find these people because they're draining the resources. Okay, whatever. But that's never what this was about. That was the cover story. And now when we look and see what ICE is actually doing, they're out harassing citizens. Like that's who's getting harassed. And now, by the way, I think this may tune in or this may connect a little bit to what was happening with Venezuela too. So, we had these operations, right, where you had all these vessels that were being blown up, right? And the story, of course, was, oh, these are narco traffickers. We're blowing up drug boats. And, Trump was saying, hey, every time we blow up a drug boat, like we save 25,000 people or some extraordinary number that he was trying to tie to how many people would be saved by blowing up a drug boat. But I think part of that was you get the people to think, okay, we blow up drug traffickers far away, right? And then you start going after illegal immigrants, a lot of whom have committed crimes. A lot of that is drug crimes. So now it's like we start blowing up drug boats far away, drug boats. Then we start going after, drug runners that are illegals here inside the United States. And then it's one step further. Now we're going after, and the next thing you get to the citizens themselves, and we're in a police state, but we were kind of led along thinking that we were cheering Trump on as he was being tough on crime or tough on drugs,
That's exactly as I see it. And then the biometrics that are coming in, exit and entry, digital IDs, and that was supposed to be at the border only. And then now it's pushing into all citizens. I mean, I was shocked. My wife is not a U.S. citizen, and I was doing the research. We don't have the plans, but if someday, one day, I wish to return to my homeland of America, I would have to petition to get my wife to do the whole citizen green card, whatever, normalization process. And now, according to the DHS rules, it says me as an American citizen, I'd have to give my DNA to the DHS to be able to go live back in my own country, to nationalize my wife. The same DHS, which had banned me from PayPal in 2022, and still continues to make my life hell. One of my new affiliates attempted just this week to give me my first payment. They're out in Europe. And it went through, I use Wise, and it went through the US bank, and it was denied. And now I'm wondering if that's a result of the same DHS policies. And they want me to give them my DNA, which is insane. But I've never heard it explained as well as you have right now with the occult ritual as the military operations. And there's a book I haven't read, but I've known about, maybe you've heard it. I think it's from China Day. 9/11 is sort of this occult ritual.
You may be talking about S.K. Bain's book that is called The Most Dangerous Book in the World.
I can't recall the title.
So if that's the book that you're referring to, yes, I am familiar with it. And so that is a look at 9/11 as an occult mega ritual, I believe is the term that he uses. That may even be in the subtitle. But yeah, so that book by S.K. Bain is a great book. And I've written a Substack on that, which people, if they want to read things that I've written at Substack, they can just find me at my name, bradmiller10.substack.com. But yes, I do believe that 9/11 was kind of a massive occult ritual. And I think that some of the symbolism there is quite apparent, like with the Twin Towers, et cetera. But there's a lot of other symbolism that was encoded into that event that is much less obvious. But he goes through and explains a lot of that. I think does a great job of doing so. But then you start asking yourself the question of, well, are there other rituals that are being perpetrated against either the American population, the population of another country, or the global population? And is it important that we understand what some of these things are? And I think that's an important question.
What might be some examples? And I've got so many questions here, but just real quick, what might be some examples of that?
So a couple. So there were some people that that noted maybe some of the occult symbolism with the whole COVID operation. The like the almost like the ritual hand washing, because they always wanted you, washing your hands, etc. Or like the 6 feet. There were people that said there may be some occult ritual significance to that. But here's maybe even some clearer examples, right? So a lot of within the United States, where we over the years have had, we've had a lot of serial killers, right? But there seems to be a lot of occult connections to serial killers, and this brings up a whole new kind of series of questions, because you can look at, well, what is the nexus between, or let's try to look at this intersection point between the intelligence services, right? The occult, secret societies, religious cults, because there are all these weird intersection points that you see. And maybe a clear example is just the Manson, and the family. But there are others. There are plenty of others when you look at just the history of serial killers. And then another is, there are a lot of occult references around the JFK assassination as well. And there are people who have even looked at that and called that a specific ritual. There's a specific ritual that is called the killing of the king. And there are people who have looked at the JFK assassination. One of these is Michael Hoffman, the researcher Michael Hoffman, who has looked at that. I think he's relying somewhat on the work of previous researchers and saying, hey, this looks a lot like the killing of the king ritual.
And I often use the term from Mark Passio, occultocracy, to best
Sure.
to describe those, the globalists. And Laurel Canyon, I think, weird scenes inside. I was going to say the gold mine, no, the canyon, by Dave McGowan, and he makes clear there is this military. It's a military intelligence occult system. You've got the Scientology stuff going on. Everything that went on with Laurel Canyon in the music scene. It's in the lyrics. It's in the music. The mixture of drugs, new age occult stuff. The military intelligence. Jim Morrison's dad being military, present at the Gulf of Tonkin false flag incident, and so maybe on COVID. Trump was just at Davos and said, and he's repeated this, but he just said it again, that COVID was a military operation. And I want to counter some of the propaganda of these. There are these X accounts that target me sometimes who are pushing a Pentagon narrative. And they say that the globalism is emanating from Moscow and China, which is totally backwards. Those, I just talked about that with Patrick Wood. China was built by the Pentagon, the Washington, Silicon Valley system. China didn't, mind control Washington to help it build out technocracy. No, this is emanating from Europe, UK, Washington, London, Brussels. And so the COVID operation was clear. Like, it wasn't China. It was DOD, DARPA, project, and then China. Everyone else sort of went along. Just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, those are great questions. Let me just say something about Weird Scenes Inside the Canyon before we move on, because I think that's a fantastic book. And for those who are not familiar with it, I think it's a great resource. It's a great book to read, and it ties in a lot of what is happening. Obviously, the focus in that book is music, but you can extrapolate from that a lot of similar things were happening in the film industry at the same time. But it will change the way you kind of think about music. But it's a fantastic reference. When you look at when we tend to think of this time period of the 60s, the 70s, there is this supposed reaction to what's happening in Vietnam, etc. And so a lot of people, the first question that would come to their minds is, but wait, but why would the CIA be running an anti-war movement? Like that doesn't, for some people, they might say that doesn't quite make sense. But when you realize that so many things are offered to us, kind of in this dialectical construct where they control both sides, you can see how, well, maybe it does make sense, that even the anti-war movement is itself being kind of propped up and astroturfed by the CIA, and you realize, well, how much of the music scene then, or the hippie movement, or this free love movement, or the drugs that come along associated with that, you can kind of see that, okay, yeah, maybe they kind of were behind this. But anyway, that's a great book. I'm really glad that you mentioned that one. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to add, I one way I see it as, it's like they create a safe space for dissent. So they don't want a real organic dissent with teeth that they can't control. And so then they're like, okay, you look at the anti-war left today. This idea of controlled opposition, not much is going on. It's like they put them in a box and, okay, you can scream as much as you want into the abyss here, and people kind of get satisfied with that. No,
absolutely. This is, that whole idea is quite Orwellian in that when you think about 1984, the 2 minutes hate that is allowed, they put up the picture of, Emmanuel Goldstein, who's kind of this avatar that you're supposed to attack, right? It's this avatar of the resistance, and you're supposed to channel your hatred into that. So they give you something to focus your energy on. But in reality, like you said, you're screaming into the abyss. And I think if you take that and you look at that globally, it explains some of what is happening with this orientation towards China and or Russia, and gets people believing, well, you'll get people who will say, but China is a real threat. We have to guard against this threat, or Russia, or, hey, but China's doing this, so we have to do this. And, we'll go back to kind of where we started today, that if you look at it from the perspective, which I know you and I do, and I do believe that this is the accurate perspective, if there's a worldwide structure that is kind of controlling all sides, then we need to look at what China or Russia or whomever else, Iran, is doing, and realize, well, what if they're just kind of operating from the script that they've been given? And our side, Trump has also been given a script. And this is also why I think Trump is, and I'll talk more about China just in a moment and kind of give my thoughts there, but this is why I think they put Trump back into the Oval Office now. And again, if people think, so this is my thoughts on the last couple of elections. So no, I don't think that Trump beat the deep state in 2016. I think they wanted Trump in 2016, but you're supposed to believe that, oh, he just got so many votes that he overwhelmed the system, and they really wanted Hillary, but Trump won, and then in 2020 they were able to rig the election and keep him out. So I know this will piss a lot of people off, but just my opinion. So I think a lot of the whole 2020 stolen election thing is, I've never been one to kind of jump on that train, and I'll tell you why. In my mind, I guess I would sum it up by saying, well, how do you steal elections that are already stolen to begin with? And elections aren't stolen on election day and election night. They're stolen during the whole campaign. They're stolen during the way in which they decide which candidates are going to run. But they're also stolen in the decades leading up to a certain election where you steer the lives of these individuals that are going to be run. Because I do think that that's what's happening. So a figure like Donald Trump, for all we know, he was earmarked as a potential United States president decades ago. And he was potentially steered along the way to be put into a position where he could potentially be used. And there are probably other people that were marked at the same time, and for whatever reason, they weren't going to work out for this reason or that reason or whatever. So I think they decided that, okay, we're going to put Trump in 2016. And there are a couple of assumptions as to why I think they did that. I think they needed Trump to be the guy who would push warp speed. It was going to have to be Trump because Trump could sell it in a way that nobody else could, right? But they wanted Biden to be the guy who would kind of get painted up as like the mandate president, the guy who really bungled the COVID response. And so people who they hate all the COVID response stuff, but they really like Trump, but they just kind of paint Biden with the COVID brush, not Trump. And they'll tell themselves, well, Trump was lied to, all right. And then now they brought Trump back to sell the technate and the technocracy, because Trump can get away with these ultra bold moves that Biden or Kamala could never get away with. Because when Trump says something on the surface that seems crazy, such as, well, we're just gonna go acquire Greenland. We got to acquire it. Even for all the Americans who think that sounds crazy, but with Trump, like people they expect him to say outlandish things and they expect him to do bold things. And so Trump can do those kind of things in a way that others can't, whether you like him or you don't or whatever, but people just be like, well, that's Trump. That's Trump being Trump. So I think he has been a very useful asset for the deep state. And I'll just kind of land this here on Trump, and then we can talk about China here in a moment. But I personally, and I know this pisses a lot of people off, but I think complex operations, right? So complex psyops. Complex psyops often involve multiple narratives, and the narratives on their face will appear to be competing, right? But in reality, they're not. But it goes back to this idea of they know they're going to catch the segment of population that will see through this narrative and then get captured by this narrative. It's the same thing that you just said when you say people will fight against this, but then there will be a safe space for them to gravitate towards, and they'll just scream into the abyss. It's the same thing. So with Trump, I think when Trump was running in 2016, and this is kind of the time period in which this term, the deep state, which had already been popularized by Peter Dale Scott. And of course, the term originates, from Turkey, et cetera. But it didn't become a household term in the United States, I think, until the 2016 campaign, because Trump was framed as this champion of liberty. He's the outsider to watch. He's the New York City businessman. He's not a Washington insider, and he's going to come in. He's going to drain the swamp. He's the champion of liberty fighting against the deep state. That's kind of how the thing was framed, right? And so what I think they did was they had, they can make Trump look good if they have the right people attack him. So if you have deep staters attack Trump, you can actually make Trump's stock go up with his base, because it helps create this idea that he is the champion of liberty fighting against the deep state.
It's like giving him street credibility. I've had past guest Richard Poe call it like sheep dipping. No.
Sheep dipping. Yeah, sheep dipping. So sheep dipping is an intelligence term, and it can mean a couple of different things. But I was just about to say that, just as you said that. It's a great point. What that kind of means is, in the intelligence community, sometimes where the term comes from, at least it's used in the intelligence community, is they will take somebody and they will pretend to have that guy come out of the intelligence services or come out of the military. They'll retire or they'll leave the service, and then they'll go do something else in the private sector. But in reality, they're still operating, within the intelligence network. Or they will do things specifically to try and launder someone's reputation, and build their street cred, just like you said. And I think they did that with Trump. And I think that there's a narrow window that they know that they can operate within. So if you attack Trump with all these things that nobody really cares about, then it builds Trump up. But the media was not going to attack him in ways that would actually tear him down. So in the 2016 campaign, or even in the 2020 campaign, you didn't see accusations against Trump of whatever, like the Epstein type stuff, those activities then, because in my mind, that's too much. You gotta attack him in ways that will build him up. you can't attack them in ways that are so substantial that they could actually tear them down. So what I'm getting at is there were limitations placed on the type of attacks that could be used against Trump because they had to be used in ways to kind of, build him up. Anyway, so that's kind of what I think they have done with Trump. I also think that Kamala, I don't even think she ran a real campaign. I think she was meant to just be a decoy. I think they realized that they were going to put Trump back in, right? And also, and this pisses a lot of people off too, but I think the incident in Butler, Pennsylvania was staged. I said that the day it happened. As soon as within 10 minutes of me learning that the event had transpired, I said, no, there's nothing about this makes sense. But so many people latch onto it. And as soon as that happened, I knew for sure they're going to put Trump back in. He's going to win the election. I also think that there's probably an occult aspect to that, just like, the nicking of the ear, all that.
I fully agree with your assessment. We are getting straight to the heart of the matter. And just to go back to BRICS and multipolarity, because I feel like this is the next psyop. So what we're talking about is the regional, and then it's the game for the planet. And you had a great tweet which I shared on my Telegram, on X, where you said BRICS and the nations in BRICS orbit do not represent a true challenge to the globalist networks of power. What is meant to appear as a new emerging East-West construct of conflict is merely an ongoing campaign of further globalist power consolidation. This consolidation effort masquerades as great power competition, but in reality, the great powers are beholden to the same globalist power structure. We are seeing Russia implement hardcore technocracy, China, here in Mexico, where I am, EU, US. It's the same, I want to curse, but I can't, darn project everywhere. Putin is like, oh, great, yeah, why not? Trump can take Greenland. I don't, yeah, cool. I'm going to give him $1 billion for his new world government institution, Board of Peace. Starmer and Carney are going to Xi Jinping. They're going to allow the Chinese, they're building this massive Chinese embassy in the city of London that's going to plug in to the cable, the internet fiber optics that carry all of the heart of the data of the financial system of Britain. So it's this symbiotic, it's like a Borg. They're symbiotically connecting East and West. This has been talked about for many years. Anthony Sutton and Anatoly Golitsyn convergence, right? And this is the world state. They're coming together as this world state. And your thoughts on all of this, as well as what's the other question here? So, how do you square that circle where you see them aligned vertically with the globalism that cannot be any longer denied? All these multipolaristas, as I call them, the LaRoucheites. Sorry, no, you guys are like, I think, what did you say earlier? I called them QAnon 2.0, or you said QAnon International.
Yeah, like international. Yeah.
Yeah, and some people call them Xenon. But what was the other? But sometimes it appears like they have conflicts in some areas, and I just kind of explained that as two Mexican cartels who they're just arguing who's going to get this corner or that corner.
Yeah. I'm constantly reflecting on this as well, because this kind of is the question, So, and it's right that we would talk about this here with geopolitics and empire, right? So, in international relations, there's this concept kind of the the two-level game. Now, again, this is within the normie narrative of how geopolitics works, right? But if you are, let's just use the United States as an example, within the normie narrative, okay, if you're the United States, you have to figure out how to operate kind of vis-a-vis other nations out there, but you also have to understand how to reconcile what you're doing with your own people and how to sell it to your people, get your people on board or whatever. And I think the way that things operate in reality, though, is it's almost a 3-level game, because if you're the United States, if you're people, whether it's Trump, whether it's people within the deep state, right? you have your own interests. You have the American public, which you probably don't really care about, but you kind of have to lead them along in some way. But then you also have the power structure that you are very much beholden to, but you still probably have your own interests. So it's kind of like you got to try to understand and operate that tri-level, hierarchy of interests. But at the end of the day, the true power structure, whoever's at the top of the totem pole of what's going on in the world, they are the big dogs, and they control a lot of the resources, while keeping themselves quite hidden. So I think there are a lot of things at play where I will concede there probably is some competition that is going on between the American deep state, that colony, and then the Russian colony and the Chinese colony, but they're still all colonies within the same vast empire. They're all vassals, and they all kind of answer to the same network. And so any one of those only has so much wiggle room to try and operate within their own interests, and where their interests come into tension with kind of the orders that they have received from above, I think they have to operate on the orders that they have received from above. And I think that when they don't do that, then they are removed or whatever, if that kind of makes sense.
I think that's one of the best explanations I've heard so far. Yeah, I perfectly see that to be the case. They have certain wiggle room. And then, what about the thought of World War III? Do you think they would go do something like that? Many of my guests don't think so. I read the old globalist texts, Warren Wager and others, who talk about they might set off some nuke or something like that somewhere to scare the global populace into finally accepting world government. But they also want to kill a whole mass of people. That was still, I feel like we can go either way, and your thesis holds true, because the Kremlin doesn't care about it. Russians, the Chinese government, the American, the Mexican, they want to kill us all. Like it's
correct.
So, and this Third World War would help out with the population democide project. And I had Denis Rancourt on during COVID, and he said COVID was like a war simulation. So if we had a World War III, whatever that entails, you get rid of free speech, rationing, digitization. Any thoughts on a third world war?
I think it's possible. Is that the way that they're going to go? I don't know, but I do think it's possible for all the reasons you just mentioned. I also think there's a massive occult aspect to war, where I think war is quite literally a blood sacrifice, right? But it's also it's a population reduction mechanism. War tends to war can be a catalyst for change, but it also introduces the kind of the worst of the human condition, because fundamentally you have human beings killing other human beings, right? And for those out there who are believers, and I am, I make no apology for that. But if you also want to look at it in that regard, then you have people, made in the image of God killing other people also made in the image of God, right? But fundamentally, you have this power structure at the top that is manipulating both sides and making them kill each other. And I think that in some ways, they would prefer for humans to kill each other, which is still them killing humans indirectly, but like they want human beings like directly engaged in the slaughter of other human beings. And I think to some degree we can see that at play with World War I, World War II. I think the common narratives that you're taught, in high school as you come up and learn about those wars, I think there's more to those, right? So I do think they could go with the big war. I think that could help them, because here's what I think is happening. And I'm not necessarily saying they have to use a war, but I certainly think they could. And with massive war, other things can come along too. Let's just think through history where war is often accompanied by financial collapse of one of the belligerents potentially, right? Or war is accompanied by famine, at least, maybe in some of the countries or areas associated with the war, maybe because of a blockade or whatever. And back to that financial piece, let's just understand that war, like if war is waged now on a massive scale, clearly just in the digital space, there's going to be all types of zeroing out of the other side's accounts. I mean, the financial aspect of war is clearly going to be at full play, right? Also, war and the way in which AI could be furthered, I see that. Also, when you look at the Cold War, and I also think there's a lot with the Cold War that doesn't quite fit into the normie framing of that, but when you have war, whether it's hot or cold, it gives both sides this excuse to engage in an arms race, And so you could take your economy, and your economy has to be put into, the development of arms or whatever. So I could see that kind of happening. But even as I say that, let me just make a quick note related on that. So there's this term that's been around for 60 plus years. Eisenhower mentioned the military industrial complex in the early 60s, right? So when we think of the military industrial complex nowadays as it relates to a potential large war, we need to take that concept and update it by 6 decades. So it's not just Lockheed Martin and Boeing and all of these other corporations that build massive hardware and all of the sophisticated software that would go with that, such as fighter jets, submarines. I mean, you can just imagine how much some of that stuff costs, right? The munitions, etc. Well, that stuff would still be important, but now as we update our idea of the military industrial complex, let's also realize, well, it's also corporations like Palantir or Oracle or Anduril, some of these others, because they're going to be a huge part of this kind of new phase of the military industrial complex.
I've been saying for the longest time, I mean, just as you said, these wars are used to birth the next stage. And I've been joking, Skynet is becoming self-aware. So with what we're seeing now, Ukraine is the testing ground and the raison d'etre, like the reason of being for birthing drones and drone swarms. And now UK, it's funny, I mentioned this week in my weekly analysis that they're shutting down the last UK helicopter plant, which employed 3,300 people, as they just unveiled the very first autonomous helicopter in the UK, which only requires 100 people at the factory. And then the Ukraine, they increased the production. Many countries now, what's going on with this war, are increasing the production of drones. First they could only produce tens of thousands a year, hundreds of thousands, and now it's becoming millions, and then it's going to be tens of millions that Ukraine, Anduril and all these companies can produce per year. And then that stuff's being exported to the rest of the world's nations. And so Skynet is becoming self-aware. And I guess then to come back for a moment to COVID 9/11, in a nutshell, what you think that operation was, and then what you think will be the next operation, because they're dealing with partially democide, killing people, meddling with our genetics, DNA, so transhumanist elements. Then the technocratic, I said in 2020 that this was to bring in, QR codes, digital passports, and all digital IDs. So thoughts on COVID 9/11 and what might be the next sort of big event?
Yeah. I think these things, so we tend to think of a coup as a one and done event, right? And I've often said, you know what, as I've thought about this a lot over the last couple of years, what if instead of a one and done event, what if there is a takeover that is happening but it's actually there's a gradual arc that is happening. But along that gradual arc, it's punctuated by these significant events that kind of move us into the new phase. So if we just go back just a couple of decades, you can think about, COVID, but 2 decades before that, it was 9/11. Before that, it was the JFK assassination. And those are just the huge ones. There are other ones along there, but you can see how those, they almost moved us into a new phase of the control architecture, which is becoming increasingly technocratic, right? So when we look at the COVID operation, which I think was a military operation, right? I think 9/11, even though it was 2 decades prior, but I think it was a preparatory step that kind of had to happen to kind of set the stage for something like the COVID op to then happen, 2 decades later. So if we look at the COVID op, which was a worldwide operation, what is that setting the stage for that could potentially happen now? And I do think that a war is quite possible. I hope I'm wrong. I'm not necessarily predicting it, but just going back to your question about, are we looking at a potential large war? I think we could be. And I'll say a couple more thoughts on why I think that's at least possible. What is the purpose behind Trump and Hegseth renaming the Department of Defense the Department of War? There's got to be more to it than just, we think it's a better name. We think it's a more apt description. We never lost a war when we were called the Department of War. Okay, that's cool rhetoric, but I think there's got to be something more substantial there. I think there's a reason why they put Hegseth in as the secretary, right? So I think secretary, and I'm not a Hegseth fan. I think he's a tool of the deep state, right? But I also can see why they might have picked him. I do think he's very articulate, I think he looks the part, but this is what's really interesting. He looks the part because he's so much different than his predecessors. So he's a guy he's about my age, so he's a guy in his mid-40s that was a major in the National Guard, as opposed to the last couple of secretaries of defense that we've had, which have been much older, and several of whom have been retired 4-stars. So you get a guy who's, 2.5 decades younger, has more vigor, right? And I think that departure from the past is meant to kind of cue in a change. And I think they're trying to kind of resell the military to the public, right? I think there may be something to that. And here's the other thing: even right now, there is still a buildup of military assets in the vicinity of the Middle East. So who knows what's going to happen? We don't necessarily know, but we could be seeing some military action here soon, and it could happen on a wide scale. And then another note that I want to say, because I think this is important. So, I made a video on my own channel, a year ago, in January of 2025, and I kind of made a video and I said, hey, here's what I think we can look at in 2025. And I basically boiled it down to 2 things. 1, setting the stage for war, and 2, basically the digital control grid, the increasing build out of the control architecture. And I think, even though we didn't necessarily get to a massive war in 2025, look at what did happen. The United States became involved in this 12-day war between Israel and Iran over the summer of 2025. And there was plenty of continued movement towards war, to include even the renaming of the Pentagon, or the Department of Defense. But now, just a couple of weeks into 2026, all those same things are happening, but much more accelerated. And to some degree, the build out of the digital control grid is just the domestic counterpart to prep for war abroad. Think about it. When there is a threat for war abroad, it's very easy to get the public to accept increased security measures here. You could see exactly how they could get the public to go along with that. And I think some of that is going to come as well.
I think, unfortunately, Yeah, I think that's where it's all headed. They need that third world war for the world state. I think, I think they might get there. That will be, they've broken us down with each sequence, as you described, World War One, World War Two, and then this might be the final one where they establish the world state, and in each region they are then can activate these digital platforms, technates in each region, which then lock us in. And I guess that leads me to one of my final questions. I've been banging on about my biggest, what I've identified as one of the biggest threats is this digital control grid, this algorithm ghetto. Like, my daily life, it's the number one thing that disturbs my daily life. I'm getting locked out of bank accounts. I tried to leave a book review for Courtney and Patrick. Amazon says I can no longer leave book reviews. They actually, I had on Michael Waller, who's former intelligence, and his book, Big Intel. And when I tried to leave a book review saying, I like this guy's book, they're like, if you leave a book review like that again, you will be banished from Amazon. I'm like, what the hell is going on? Seriously. And people around me in Mexico, they lap up this techno-fascism. It's the same everywhere. I'm like, look, people, if I can't even leave a book review anymore, what do you think is going to happen when they make mandatory, as they have declared now, digital ID, digital passports, mobile phone registrations? Like, if you're not even allowed to leave a book review, what do you think they're going to do to you once they get you in the system? It's going to be complete rape, And so, what's sort of your vision? Again, not that it's not that I want this. It's like we're seeing them construct this, and I'm looking where it's going, and it's like, concentration camp. We're on the train, and they're going to exterminate us once we get there. How do you sort of see the end game of this digital control grid?
Yeah, it's a great question. Two things that I would say. So one of the things that I think is happening right now is it's almost a new form of the strategy of tension that we saw as part of Operation Gladio that happened kind of in the wake of the Cold War, or the wake of World War II, amidst the backdrop of the Cold War, right? So for people who are unfamiliar with that, first of all, I would tell people, do a little bit of reading on Operation Gladio, and then just try and think of ways in which that may be analogous to things that are happening right now, either globally or within the United States or within other countries where people might live. So basically what was happening is, after World War II, there was this shift from the Allies towards recognizing the Soviet Union as maybe the next big threat. And during the Cold War, there was this idea that the most dangerous course of action from the Soviet Union would be if they were to just invade Western Europe, right? So there were these groups of individuals that were known as these stay-behind networks that were controlled by the intelligence services in these Western European nations, some of which even had access to stockpiles of weapons that were supposed to be there, maybe even be trained and be ready to stand up and at least form some sort of skeleton resistance force that could then later be reinforced to stop the Soviets if they invaded westward. That was kind of the cover story. In reality, what was happening is the CIA, once it was created, a couple years after the end of the Cold War, MI6 were working with the intelligence services in these nations to control these groups, and they were using them to conduct acts of sabotage, etc. And a lot of times they would then attribute those acts to these leftist extremist groups. So we can see kind of the dialectic then between, what's happening with the left and what's happening with the right. And this became known as the strategy of tension because of the heightened levels of anxiety that would happen with the public, where the public is like, I can't even go to the train station today because train stations are being bombed, or buses are being bombed, or whatever. So what happened? Well, the left is blamed for the chaos, and the left, a lot of these leftist extremist groups were engaged in these acts as well. But sometimes it was these stay-behind networks committing acts that we would call terrorist acts, and then attributing them to these leftist extremist groups, right? But either way, the people would then allow their government, a lot of which were authoritarian right-wing governments at the time, to come in heavy-handed, drop the hammer, and implement these draconian security measures that under normal circumstances, the people would never permit. Now take that, update it, look at it in the United States, and look at how you see the left being used a lot of times to control to produce the chaos, right? And then a lot of the people then will allow, government to come in. I mean, just think about what's happening with ICE, or, pick your example, but you see where, the government will come in and kind of drop the hammer and implement these draconian authoritarian measures that the people would normally never allow. But look at how the Patriot Act happened, So that's kind of my first point, is understanding that same strategy of tension is being used right now. So if people are unfamiliar with Operation Gladio, maybe go look it up, do a little bit of reading, and then understand how it could be implemented nowadays. Other thing about the control grid. So I got a book right here because I'm actually I do teach some courses sometimes with a website that is called IPAC-edu. IPAC stands for the Institute of Pure and Applied Knowledge. It started as a forum for people to come together and kind of learn about science. And I do some work there and teach some courses there. And we've built the catalog of courses that we're offering. It goes far beyond just science. But there's a course that I've been teaching that's called Literature as Resistance. And in it, we read kind of what has become known as the canon of dystopian literature. We read 1984. We read Brave New World. We read Fahrenheit 451. This iteration of the course, we're going to read some nonfiction work that has been written by Dr. David Hughes. But there's another work of fiction that people are less familiar with that we're actually reading right now. So this book is called We. And it's written by a Russian author whose name is Yevgeny Zamyatin. And it's a great book that a lot of people who maybe they're familiar with Brave New World or 1984, but they may not be familiar with this work. And it actually precedes those other two. So the work was written in the early 1920s, kind of still within the Russian Revolution. And
sorry to interrupt. I've got my copy right here.
There you go.
And the thing that irks me is that I was reading this a long time ago, and everyone references 1984, and it's like this is one of the originals, which was produced like in the 19-teens or early
1920s. Yep.
2024, and then it's like We Zamyatin, and then it's Brave New World, right. And then it's right. Orwell. So anyway, please continue. So for the
so Orwell was very open about having been influenced by this work. And others have said that Aldous Huxley was too. Aldous Huxley himself says that he did not come across the work We until after he had published Brave New World. I don't know if that's true. When I read We, I see a lot of potential points of influence for Brave New World. But regardless, this is a really interesting book. But for those who have never heard of this, and I realize that a lot of people in the West are not familiar with this, this is a book that was written between 1920 and 1921. It was censored by the Soviet Censorship Bureau, had to be smuggled out to the West. It was published first in English in 1924, later published in Russian. And it's an example of those who are familiar with the concept of samizdat. So that was this concept of within the Soviet Union passing around literature that had been banned. And a lot of times it would mean copying manuscripts by hand. Well, this is an example of that. But it's also an example of a related concept that is called tamizdat, which means publishing externally. So it means, smuggling a manuscript out of the Soviet Union, typically to the West, where it could be published. So the novel We is actually an example of both. But and people should really read this book, but here's why. So this novel is 100 years old, and it posits a setting in which you have a state that is almost governed by the principle of mathematics. And the protagonist of the novel is a guy who doesn't even have a name. He goes by D503, so a letter and a combination of numbers. And that's how people are known, right? And D503 is an engineer and a mathematician. And one of his jobs is he works on this spaceship that this, futuristic state is working on. Again, this is a novel that was written 100 years ago. So the protagonist, he's often kind of as he's writing, and the novel's written in the first person, but he is engaging in almost a lot of a philosophy that is informed by the principles of mathematics, and this state, because it's governed by math, it kind of sees mathematical optimization as the way in which you run a state. It's governed by math, which is infallible and perfect and harmonious, not, infallible human beings. So let's take that concept and update it a century, and you realize how, well, wouldn't that be the same thing nowadays as being run by algorithms or run by AI, not fallible human beings? And so when we think about technocracy, this is how this is going to be, sold to us. I mean, we just saw a couple of days ago, there was this announcement all over social media where part of, what is it, the 20-point plan they're implementing in Gaza, but it has a technocratic component. They're calling it technocratic governance. They're being very open about that. But of course, that's the way they're going to sell it to you. They're going to sell it to you as, why would we not have, this mathematically optimized society? And if that means getting rid of the fallible human component and bringing in the all-knowing component, or the all-knowing computers or AI. I mean, you can almost hear Yuval Noah Harari saying this, right? You can hear him saying this. Like, I can see how they can get people to buy into this, and in reality, what does that lead to? Well, it leads to like this hyper utilitarian notion of, well, if the math doesn't work out, then you may find yourself on the outside because you are no longer deemed fit to contribute to society, or because you consume more than you produce, or because you're too old, or because you have some sort of other condition that is seen as not being able to contribute your fair share. I mean, you see how you take like the actuarial sciences, you take them to an extreme, and then you get to a point where it's, hey, the algorithm has decided that you are no longer fit to be part of this society,
The MAID programs, right? Twilight Zone,
Right.
Obsolete Man. And they're lowering, this is, again, democide, death by government, eugenics, Canada, Scotland, and Mexico. They're starting now, their rumblings. And each time they lower hey, you're 18 years old, 20 years old, you feel depressed, we're going to take you out of your misery. Yeah. And so maybe to add to that. So basically, they're bringing in digital ID now and forcing us to register our phones. So omnivalence, so total surveillance. And basically, I had on Edwin Black years ago with David Hughes. Edwin Black calls it the algorithm ghetto. We just chatted with Patrick Wood. So basically, if they succeed, it's going to be living in, drones, AI, social credit. So every action you do they're going to calculate it, and then it's going to determine your further permissions. And it's going to be like a total scientific dictatorship dystopia.
Mm-hmm.
Is that?
Yeah, I think that is exactly what we are headed into. They are going to try and quantify every action that you take, and it's either going to be, a plus or a minus, kind of the old social credit thing, but just taken to an extreme, right? But they will sell it to people because they will get some people to at least buy into, this is how we optimize the good of society. But again, who's determining what is good? Who's trying to take some of these elements that we have always maybe looked at more qualitatively than quantitatively, and saying, this is how we're going to govern society. Yeah. And I think it's quite dangerous, because it's not actually going to be about optimizing happiness. It may be about optimizing stability, but those who are going to determine the stability are, again, these, engineers that sit atop of the power structure, that are not worried about, you, me, our freedoms, our desires, the safety and security of our families, our communities, etc.
Just one, another question. We're talking about Laurel Canyon, and I don't know if it was Steve Poikonen or someone who coined the phrase Laurel Canyon 2.0, but talking with other folks, I want to ask you just about the alternative media controlled opposition, because if we look at the whole 60s sex, drugs, and rock and roll anti, the counter culture movement, and it's clear now it was manufactured largely, and there's nuance there. There's a gray zone, which musicians, to what extent, what was organic, whatever. But it's clear that there was military intelligence, CIA, Scientology, occult, New Age societies, creating all that stuff. The psychedelics, you can go beyond the Overton window, where psychedelics open you up, to demons and channeling, and all these guys, like Steve Jobs said, there's just some intersection between psychedelics, the interdimensional, and cybernetics, I think. But now I noticed that we had the rock and roll scene, and then the internet came online, 90s, 2000s, and rock sort of died as the internet was coming up to speed, iPhones, social media. And so it's like Laurel Canyon sort of died. And now the podcast space, alternative media, blogs, is almost like Laurel Canyon 2.0. And the actors within this space are tied to the same CIA military intelligence networks, the New Age Gnostic theosophy, occult stuff. It's like it's just been transplanted from rock music to podcasts and social media. Alex Jones, who I grew up listening to, he's now promoting the North American Technate and technocracy. He's tweeting this week, Davos has failed. I'm like, do you think are you really going to believe Mark Carney said, they say globalization is dead? I'm like, are you kidding me? Like, we're moving on to the next phase. Tucker's dad is CIA, Andrew Tate's dad CIA. Andrew Tate is like, yeah, let's take Venezuela and let's take everything. I'm like, and then Alex Jones' dad is CIA. And so, just any thoughts on this and the controlled ops space? I don't want to go calling out everyone, but it's clear. It's it's clear.
It's a great point. I can't believe that people keep falling for this, but I will tell you, a lot of times when they offer, this is what people have to kind of learn to recognize, right? When it comes back to how do we critically think appropriately, and how do we engage in discernment? Well, one of the patterns that they seem to use over and over, because it works, is they offer you something that they know you're going to reject, but then they immediately offer you like the secondary option, and that seems to like capture people, and they use this over and over and over again. One of the things that I thought was the most telling, so I think it was 2 Christmas Eves ago, there was a video that was uploaded to Twitter or X, and it was this like 7-minute conversation between Tucker Carlson and Kevin Spacey, except it wasn't Kevin Spacey, it was Kevin Spacey in character, from House of Cards, Frank Underwood. Do you know what I'm talking about? Do you remember this little conversation?
I remember
this.
It was
super weird. Okay, so here's the reason why people should go back and listen to that. It's like 7 minutes long. Go back and listen to it, because I remember coming across that and people did not know what to make of it. And I thought that was one of the most telling things that they have revealed to us, because one, you have a real guy, Tucker Carlson, talking to, at least as real as we know, right? Talking to a fictitious character, because he's not talking to Kevin Spacey. He's very clearly talking to Frank Underwood. It's already kind of blurring the lines. So that's already weird. But in there's this comment that is made about this intersection between what is true and what's false, what's life and what's art. And I remember thinking, oh, that's it. Like, that's it. They know they're blurring the lines, and they want people to realize, or they want people to never know if what they're seeing is real, or it's an act, or it's art, or it's real life, or it's true, or it's false, or whatever. So I would encourage people to go back and listen to that. I can't remember the exact quote, but it was very much they were bringing about this intersection between life and art, and performance, or an act, and then true and false. And here's another thing that I'll say on that. because this kind of, I think, is what was happening with the whole Venezuela thing a couple of weeks ago. Americans, and maybe other people around the world too, but Americans are particularly susceptible to this, right? We want a show. And if we get caught up in the spectacle, the flashiness, right? The showiness of the spectacle, then we may not ask questions such as what's real, or what's true, or what's legal, or what's moral, because we're caught up in the show. And if you're caught up in the show, I think subconsciously you can suspend belief, like you do when you watch a movie, right? But you may suspend belief without being consciously aware that you're suspending belief. And I think that they realize that, these grand narrative engineers, they realize that, and they realize that if they blur the lines enough, you can maybe, and I'm reaching here a bit, but I think there's something to this. If subconsciously you know that what you're watching is not real, but consciously you don't know that, then you may suspend belief without being aware that you have suspended belief. And now consciously you're latching on to something that subconsciously is fake. And so now there's a disconnect that is happening within you that you're not consciously aware of. And I think that is, and I'll kind of land this plane here, I think that describes a lot of what is happening right now. And I think that is a component of worldview warfare. So worldview warfare, it comes from this German term, Weltanschauungskrieg. I'm not a German speaker, so that's my best attempt at that. But I love that term because I think that term is so much more comprehensive and therefore an apt descriptor of what is happening than psychological operations, because worldview warfare is exactly what it sounds like. It is, a full spectrum attack on your worldview, which is not just what you believe, but how you arrive at those beliefs. And it can attack you in ways that you don't necessarily recognize, and therefore you are unprepared to adequately defend against. And I think when that happens, and we saw this with COVID, right? It's still happening now. But when that happens, when people are bombarded with all types of information and they have no idea how to sift through these competing sources or whatever, they arrive at a point of epistemological nihilism. And what that means is they can no longer determine what is real or true or accurate. And so they just get to a point where they just don't even care. Now, they may not admit that to themselves, but they do arrive at that point. At least some people do, right? And what that may look like is people saying, even if they don't admit it to themselves, but in reality, what they're they get to a point where they're just thinking to themselves, I don't know how to figure out what is true. So I'm just going to follow the path of least resistance. And now, again, they may not say that to themselves in those words, but that's kind of what's happening. They just fall back to the path of least resistance. And what that will look like in real life is, I don't know what to do, so I just need the authority figures to tell me what to do. And if you tell me to put on a mask, I'll put on a mask. If you tell me to take a shot, I'll take a shot. And if you tell me to do whatever, then I'll do that too, because I don't know how to make the decisions on my own.
I think you've explained that well. I saw a meme yesterday where I can't find it now, but it was something to the tune like, when we're kids, we're like, don't tell me what to do, and then when we're older, like, please explain to me exactly what I need to do. I guess right. my last question, is twofold. Usually, what do we do, to push it back? And then how do we survive? And I'm just increasingly focusing more on I'm running to the hills. How do I survive this dystopia? Because they are just moving forward and we are retreating. And I'm also looking at it. I think you mentioned faith. I look at it from the biblical worldview, where here on this earth we don't win. Satan eventually takes the planet for a brief moment in time. And so for me, it's kind of like, you're a soldier. All these people talk about blackpilling. Well, when you're on the battlefield, you're not going to be telling, hey, guy, bombs are flying. It's like, man, it's not being so black-pilled. It's, they're advancing. it's kind of silly at this point. So just your final thought, and any final thought, and what do we do and how do we survive?
Yeah, I mean, that kind of is the question, right? So, yeah, I think about this a lot too, as I'm sure you do, and many of your listeners do as well. And we have to talk about this because we have to be solutions oriented. But I also think that there are not with you. I think you have to ask the question, but I also think some people ask the question knowing that there are no easy answers, and then when you don't give them the cookie cutter solution, then they attack you for that. Oh, all you do is bring up the problem with no solutions. I'm sure you probably hear that a lot too. I do as well, and that is and so first I would kind of frame my answer by saying there are a lot of people out there who have no understanding of the problem that want easy cookie cutter solutions. And it's like, you don't even have a full appreciation of the problem. And I'm not saying I have a perfect understanding of the problem, but there are people out there who have no idea what's actually going on, operating with very little discernment, and yet get angry at other people because they can't give them like a 3-step, do this, and then, we win. That said, we do need to be solutions oriented. We need to be people of action, right? And there are still a lot of people around the world that are sitting on the couch. So what I would say is we are in a war and you are a combatant in that war, even if you think you aren't. And if you don't want to be, that's fine, but just understand that the other side, those who are kind of, waging war on all of us, by other side, I don't mean the Chinese or the Russians, right? But the other side very much views you, your family, your children, your grandchildren, whatever, as legitimate targets. So understand that. So if you think you just kind of want to sit this out, just understand that. Back to the biblical worldview. So I do think that there is a lot to be said for putting your own house in order first. And since you brought that up that way, I'll kind of say it like this. Like, there are a lot of people who get upset when people say pray. But if you believe in the power of prayer, then you realize, let me just put this back in that war framing, then you realize that those are actual tactics that can have discernible effects on the battlefield, even if it's in an intangible way. And so there is something to be said for, because if you want to look at this as being spiritual, foundationally spiritual, which I do, then you have to understand that this war may manifest itself along many different modalities, but fundamentally it's spiritual. And when I say that it's spiritual, that's not a metaphor. It's not a metaphor. And I think I got this wrong for a long time. I think that for a long time, would speak about spiritual war or spiritual warfare metaphorically, and I think that's incorrect. It's not a metaphor for war. It is war. It is it is war. It's just a little bit different than the way we traditionally think of war, because we tend to have an overly narrow way. So I would say that. So there are things we can do spiritually that will have discernible effects on the battlefield, the real battlefield. So in that regard, if we seek to put our own houses in order first, the way that I live my personal life can have effects beyond just me and my life. I'm coming to believe that more and more. I'm not saying I didn't believe it before, but I'm just coming to realize that more and more. The other thing is, and this kind of goes with, starting with yourself, then starting with your personal relationships, then starting with your community, right? And then kind of a bottom-up approach. We all want to go to the top first. I think that's natural, and I get it, but I think many of us are coming to realize you got to start from the bottom up. And from the bottom up means yourself. Your personal discipline. Are you keeping yourself healthy? Are you prepared? Are you prepared in a spiritual sense? Are you prepared in a physical sense? Here in the United States, they're talking about this massive snowstorm coming over this weekend. Will it come? Will it not come? I don't know. But just using that as an example, are people prepared? Who's your community? If you can't operate within the medical establishment anymore, and you need healthcare, where do you go? Where do you get your food from? Where are you getting your spiritual guidance from? Who are your friends? You know, who do you hang out with? Is it people that are enriching your life, or is it people that are maybe aren't necessarily bringing value to your life? So I realize that's kind of abstract, but I think what we need to do is realize that, well, maybe it's not as abstract as maybe thoughts and prayers is not as abstract as many of us think at first glance, if that makes sense, you know?
It makes sense. I don't have anything to add to that. We've covered a lot, and I think you've had great analysis and said things in ways I haven't heard before that crystallized a lot, from the occult, from the rituals and military operations, to the East versus West sort of dialectic. And it goes back to Teddy Roosevelt's do what you can with what you got where you're at. And a lot of people are looking for these one size fits all solutions from the top level. And it's just like, I think the internet has made us think, and life was always in human history mostly local, right? We were mostly relegated to where we are. And I think in some sense we do need to move back to that. Well, your links are in the description. Again, where are the best places to follow you, find you?
Yeah. So people can find me at on X or Twitter. People can find me just at my name, so at Brad Miller 1010. They can find me on Substack, bradmiller10.substack.com. And then also, if people go to YouTube and they just put in the search bar Brad Miller 10, my channel should come up. It's just me, just myself. No real, it's just me. No real production value, but I do upload videos every now and again about things that I just kind of want to expound on. And just kind of a closing thought here, I would say, a lot of people are going to want to opt out of this technocracy, which I think is let's do that to the extent possible. But let's understand that they also can foresee that many people are going to opt out, and they're going to give people an alternative solution that makes people think they're opting out when it's really just opting into something else that they're going to have set up to capture you. So I would just say, let's be aware of that. They can see several chess moves ahead of what many people are going to do. So just remember that as we're trying to opt out, that there may be some easy solutions to move into that may be, not where we necessarily want to go.
I will admit, I mean, I think a superior intelligence is behind this, Satan, Lucifer, and he's smarter than us, in one sense, dumber in the other, spiritually.
Sure.
But
Sure.
in terms, I think him and his minions are more intelligent. And so I think of movies like Maze Runner, when you look at what was that group, the ending was horrible, but they could just see many steps ahead. They have the resources and the knowledge, and so they are way ahead of us. But we have the kryptonite, right? The Gandalf, the God Jesus, who defeats all this in the end. But well, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Great conversation. Appreciate it. I know I can be a little bit long-winded in my responses, but thanks. I really enjoyed the conversation.